And welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage. And you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. So today, my guest is Jamie Gerdsen. Jamie wears several hats. So he's the president and CEO of Apollo Home, which is a family owned and operated business that's been around since 1910. He's the author of a couple of books, Squirrels, Boats, and the Thoroughbreds, and also Zombies Ate My Business. So those are interesting books. He's very involved in EO and YPO, as well as a bunch of other organizations in the Cincinnati area, the Gordon Center for Family and Private Business, Habitat for Humanity in Cincinnati, a couple other spots there. And Jamie went to BU on a scholarship for rowing. So I don't know if I've had a rower on yet. So let's row our way through this, Jamie. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me aboard.
So you fit sort of this classic example of the business dude, the entrepreneur that has a perspective based on their experiences, their business, their the trials and tribulations, and then goes down the path of writing some books, doing some things, and speaking a little bit about it, and sort of tell us how the content came to be, because this wasn't some theoretical abstract something. It came from real world experience.
Yeah, so the first book was really written as a result of me wanting to highlight all the lessons I learned along the way, right? So my dad was a pretty influential guy in my life. He has been a really great mentor, probably one of the better mentors I've had. I know that's unusual for people to say about their dad sometimes, but I wanted to take sort of all the tribal knowledge I had learned from him, all the knowledge I had learned from things like EO, YPO, and other sort of, I'll say, curious journeys that I went on. And I wanted to encapsulate it in sort of a book that would tell those stories of all those things that you learn along the way. That's really where that came out of. And I think the thing that really kicked it off for me was I was in a very traditional business, right?
Yep.
We were a heating, air conditioning, residential, light commercial business.
Right. Not sexy in Cincinnati. So not a particularly sexy business, not a particularly sexy market.
Not at all. In fact, from a growth
Yep.
perspective, the only way we grew was we stole a customer from somebody else. This wasn't blue ocean theory. This wasn't
Yeah.
something
Right. Right.
it was go to work really hard, and crank.
Yep.
Along the way, deal with people that really don't think about organizational psychology or think about organizational structure or growth. They think about, I need another dollar an hour, right? And
Right.
so that's a hard group to motivate.
Got it. Got it. So that's where that came from. And then, you spent a couple years on the books and getting those books out there while you're running the business, while the business is growing at a phenomenal rate. But most importantly, at least from my perspective, you actually implemented so many of the theories and things that you talk about in the books in the business. So you're using Apollo as a laboratory and the outcomes have been cool. So can you talk about some of the things that you installed or instilled at Apollo and some of the outcomes of that based on the content?
Yeah, for sure. So I think really the tip of the iceberg was, there are three things our business does today, which is marketing, training, and really logistics, right? We're still in the heating air conditioning business, although we expanded the portfolio to offer more trade services. But one of the things that we really focused on in the first book was like squirrels, boats, and thoroughbreds. Well, if you want to climb a tree, do you want a dog or a squirrel? Well, of course, you want a squirrel. So we spent a lot of time thinking about what was the epitome of a squirrel in our business, who was the right person to sit in the right seats. And then we did a lot of analytical testing and studying around those concepts and built out profiles for each individual person that worked here in terms of their roles and what they had to look like to fit. So we took a really strategic approach on how to attracting the right people in the right seats.
Got it. And that worked,
It
right?
did, yeah, it did work. I mean, we saw our turnover go down exponentially, probably close. I think the number was around our turnover decreased by 70% and our revenues increased by 85%. So we had a huge delta between that.
So when you add those two things up, so turnover is, I would imagine, typically would be massive in the HVAC business. If you can cut that 70%, bang, that's money to the bottom line. And then obviously growing your revenue at the same time after or while you've cured this turnover problem changes the game from a profitability perspective.
Dramatically changes the game. I mean, the reality, each FTE or each full-time employee equivalent that we lose was $25,000 of just hard cost, right? Between training and onboarding and getting them up and running.
Just
And
dollars
so,
out the door. Yeah.
correct. And so by reducing that turnover, but then also at the same time, increasing the right people in the right seats, we were able to get a lot of lift. And as a result, we ended up really driving the business pretty exponentially and allowed us to add more trades. Recently we moved to a new corporate headquarters. It's 5 times our old space, and we continue to dominate the market through market share.
Fantastic. So I want to move now to sort of where you're going with the content. So you and I have been doing some things together over the last year and change, and have really taken all the ideas that you had in the books and elsewhere, as well as the experiences that you've had at Apollo and the wonderful outcomes there, and have now sort of packaged it a little bit differently. So do you want to talk about sort of the transformation that you're, well, I would say you're still going through from a thought leader to sort of the business side of the thought leadership, as opposed to, expensive hobby to actually an entity that can serve clients on its own?
Yeah, sure. I think the best way I would say is Apollo went through a revolution that then led to an evolution, which started off Main Street Leadership. So when I thought about how our business was a revolution to start, we had a huge amount of opportunity to grow the business. And so we did a lot of different things that we talked about. I talked about the Squirrels, Boats, and Thoroughbreds, and Zombies Ate My Business. The next thing we did is I took those concepts and with your help and your team's help, Peter, we were able to divide and create, I think, what I would say, for the lack of a better term, is an assessment based system that allows us to create a path for a company to go from non-growth to growth. And where all those learnings really came from was we used Apollo as a laboratory, as you mentioned earlier. We are in the um, boringest business there is. We don't attract MBAs from Harvard or Yale, or the
Yep.
brightest and the biggest. We attract guys who mid-20s decide they want to find a new career,
Yep.
right? And so by taking that and understanding, okay, if we believe, and I believe, that every business, regardless of its vertical, is a growth business. The differentiation is the life cycle of where that business and that owner is. And I think Main Street Leadership has been a really fun project because we've started to create assessment tools that allow us to really predict and then get people back on the growth curve through different tools and
Yeah.
sets.
So let's just take that a half a step back. So the first thing is, from all this content, you created this thing called Main Street Leadership. So let's just talk about what that is, because you created a leadership development company that is focused on a target market of folks that look like Apollo. So blue collar trade. So just talk about sort of what Main Street Leadership is and its mission and who it's trying to help and how you're going about that.
Sure. So I think Main Street Leadership itself. I mean, when you look at it at its fundamental root and its core, it's a system of assessments that help a business understand where they are, and then more importantly, where the people in that business are. And then there's a toolkit that comes along after we go through that assessment and building out that sort of the plan from the assessment tools that we have into what I like to call the journey, right? Of the journey of getting that business really back focused on its growth curve and getting its management team basically focused, then hoping the front line get focused and get everybody sort of rowing in the same direction.
Got it. So part of this process, and this is where I want to talk for a moment, is you've got this content. There's lots of things you can do with it, but we had to make some decisions together around how do we shape this? How do we position this? Who do we serve? Who we're going to be most successful with? And I think there is a tendency to go after the shiny, sexy. Every company is going to be the next Google, Facebook, whatever. And the realization that you came to was, wait a minute, like most businesses in this country, most of the time are doing things like HVAC. Somewhat like, as you said, boring, routine, necessary. There's nothing wrong with these businesses. Block and tackle stuff, that need to be done. And a lot of the people running those businesses don't really have the prerequisite skills as leaders. They come at it from either, it's a family business, or they've got the technical expertise to be an air conditioning guy or whatever the case is. But how do you motivate people? How do you get people to do things that they may not want to do? How do you hold people accountable? How do you create a culture where people want to come to work and they can see a career path? And I think that was sort of the magic, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is I thought a lot about a lot of things. And one of the things we think about all the time is, do you drive fast or slow to work? Right?
Yep.
Are people driving fast to work or not? And then number two is, are they living their dream or yours? So is the organization, as the owner of the business, is that vessel that you own for you or for your teams or for your people? What we knew is that the old adage that strategy gets trumped by culture every time couldn't be more true truth, right? And so the reality is in our business, which is a service-based business, the only way we knew we were going to grow is that if the people on the really in our organization had a clear career path on what that looked like and understood how they plugged in and understood, frankly, all the things that were going to help them grow as people. But without a clear understanding from a leader or an owner all the way down to the front line, there was no way you're going to get growth in a traditional business.
Got it. Got it. And it's the whole cycle, right? It's the attraction, it's the retention, it's the customer service, etc. If you're enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about our podcast, please leave us a review and share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcast and on all major listening apps, as well as at thoughtleadershipleverage.com/podcasts. So, given that you've been in this space, broadly speaking, of thought leadership for, whatever, 6, 8 years, something like that, what are some of the things, A, that you've learned, and then B, that you would advise someone thinking about sort of diving in? You're at a cocktail party or something, and somebody says, "Hey, Jamie, I want to write a book." Like, tell us what you've learned and what you might counsel someone else in a similar situation.
Sure. I think the key thing I learned is that, thinking that you can and doing are very different things. So, in other words, a lot of people say, "Hey, I've got a great business and I think I can go write a book." Well, okay, great. You want to go write a book, but writing a book doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be successful, if that makes sense.
Right.
So
Right.
in my thing, I think the real thing is that it's really about putting your focus around execution, right? And so to me, the one thing I learned is there are a lot of people that'll say a lot of things, but the way we're going to win is you got to execute, right?
So, but let me push on that with regards to the book. So, I can't tell you how many times, and I'm sure you've experienced something similar. You're out and about, or you're at an event or a conference or something like that, and then somebody realizes they read your book. Oh man, I've got there's a book I was going to write, or I've got one I'm thinking about, and most people don't talk about execution as it relates to authorship, but you just said it, like, okay, well, what are you doing about it? Like, how are you going to do it? Because thinking about writing a book and actually getting one done, two totally different things.
Not only that, but it's just because you write a book doesn't mean it's worth writing. Like that's the other thing. I think
Yeah, right.
the thing is that make sure that your ego doesn't drive you to write a book that nobody will read. Right? Me being my worst critic, I think of the books that I've written, my first was probably a little bit better than my second. I mean, to be frank and transparent. I mean, I think the content that I gave was content that actually I used. So I think the first thing is if you're going to write a book,
Sure.
make sure it's worthwhile to read. Right? That's the first step.
Yep.
Then the next step is once you write a book, is that the beginning of the journey for you or is it the end? For me, it was the beginning. I felt like I created content that was vital to get out in the market because I think that content was usable content and it was an evolved content that I continue to use today and see growth, right?
So that beginning or end is interesting because for some people, it's always about the why. Well, why are you writing the book? Well, it's something I believe in. It could be a forcing mechanism to get you to codify your thinking. You just want to give birth to it. There's lots of different reasons. And that could be for some the end. Then I wrote the book and it's done and I feel like I've accomplished something. And that's awesome, right? But for you, it's interesting that it was the beginning of sort of a way to broadcast this thinking in various formats to different people outside of the world of your business.
Correct. I mean, I felt like, hey, look, we figured out something pretty unique. And what that was in a business that is a blue collar business where people can't find people. Well, we solved that problem, right? So we have a unique set of circumstances at the business called Apollo Home where we don't have a problem finding new people. In fact, we have a waiting list for programs to get people involved with our business. And how do we do that, right? It was a very specific, thoughtful strategy that came out of the guts of all the content that we wrote.
Yep.
So, and so part of it is, yes, great, you want to write a book. I think the first question is, does anybody want to read it? The next question is it the beginning or the end, right? And if it's the beginning, well, be disciplined enough to know that what you think the end looks like isn't really the end, and then be disciplined enough to carry it all the way through. And I guess the last thing I will say is just because you're successful in one area in your career doesn't mean that you'll be successful in another. And I think that
No, I think that's a phenomenal point because, I would imagine if I plucked you out of Cincinnati and dropped you into a company similar to Apollo in, we're at Denver or something like that, it wouldn't take you all that long to figure it out, right? But transferring from one business with a certain sort of standards and best practices and cadences and all that into this new world of thought leadership is no guarantee that you're going to kill it there.
That's correct. I mean, but I think there's a hubrisness with successful entrepreneurs, as I'm sure you're well aware. They legitimately think that because I was successful in one place, I can be successful in another. And I think you would agree, based on your experience as well, talking to thought leaders, is there is a unique set of circumstances that dictate success, right? And there
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
just because you think that you have this great thing and it's perfect, and I think sometimes people fall in love with themselves, and they say, well,
Yeah.
people should listen to me because I'm an expert in blah, blah, blah.
Because I said so.
And the problem is, what happens is guys and gals who are running businesses are surrounded by people that will tell them what they need to hear to feel really good about what
Right.
they're doing, when the reality is that's not always true, right?
Got it. So what else would you say, someone's sitting out there today, totally different business, totally different industry, totally different starting point, and they've got the itch. A couple friends told them you should write a book, or they just thought they should write a book, or whatever. Because that's usually how it starts. That's usually the crossover drug to thought leadership is someone says write a book. Let's light this up, and then you could wind up the equivalent of a thought leader crackhead or something if it goes wrong. But what would you tell those people? What they should be thinking about?
I guess what I would say is, first and foremost, how committed are you?
Okay.
Right? Like, what's the level of commitment? And what I mean by that is, why don't you start with trying to write the first chapter? Put your head around it. Like, just start writing. And I think part of the deal is, a lot of people think I guess the example I like to use is, a lot of people think that it's a destination, and it's not. In other words, I know some people that are thought leaders that write every day, and they're very disciplined about it. And they write at the same time every day, and they put 250 to 500 words on a page, right? And here's the $1 million question. It's great that they do that, but it doesn't mean that what they're writing is actually valuable. So the $1 million question, or the question I always think about, is, am I solving a current problem? Like, am I unique enough to solve a problem with what I know? And to me, maybe that's not the same for other people, but for me, I really wanted to write something that had value for commerce and value for organizations that employed people that would actually be better off if they had the content that I had my hands on. Because I really felt like at Apollo, the driver for me, again, was that I felt like we figured out some stuff and we needed to share it.
One, I think it's an interesting point because the flip side of that is let's think about the mind or the life of the reader, right? They're busy. There's a promise or an expectation they have when they choose to read a book. Either it was recommended or they read a nice review, and they're hoping to get something out of it, not just a recap of things they already know or a statement of the obvious or something, but they need to get an insight. They need to get an actionable. They need to have something brought to them in a way that's new and refreshing that they can actually do something with versus just sort of noise in the background. I call it sort of like the TV on in the background, but you're not even listening to it. Like, we don't have the time for that anymore today. If I'm going to invest 5-8 hours or whatever it takes to of my life to read a book, I want a return on that. I want to get something out of it, and I'm not going to I'm going to put it down if I'm not getting that.
Correct. Very much so. And I think that the challenge is that, when we look at, or I start to look around, I go to the whole theory that just because you think that you know how to solve a problem doesn't mean that you actually know how to solve a problem. Does that make sense to you? Like, I think there's a level of ego and hubrisness that actually compels people to write books, because let's face it, anybody can write a book, right?
Sure.
But not everybody can write a good book, and very, very few people can write a great book. And I think that if you think, and for me, I didn't need a book. Like, all right, I'll tell you the story. So recently, a guy I knew wrote a book, and it was a book about his business. And frankly, it was kind of blah.
Yep.
But he hired somebody to write it. He wrote it, got it written. Then he hired a ghost publisher to publish it. He sent me a copy, and I will never read his book. I mean,
And he spent a lot of money,
right.
spent a lot of time. Now, maybe it's an ego play. Maybe he doesn't know the quality's bad, but that also says something. Like this is someone that you admire in other domains of his life, produces something, and you're like, mediocre. It kind of says something too that's not so good.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the point of my story, I guess, is Peter, for me, it's I want to help solve issues, right? I want to create impact. And
Yep. Yep.
and really what the main driver for me was is I want to actually create more jobs, right? Like that's what drives me. And the only way I know to create more jobs is get companies to grow. And the only way to get companies to grow is to put them in a place where they can assess I'll say a non-ego way, where are they really? And then gravitate towards a platform that allows them to do that thing. So for me, with authors and thought leaders, I guess I guess the real question here is this, and I've been trying to stop saying $1 million question because it's not great. So the real question for me, I think, and anybody really should ask themselves is what you are trying to do, is it for you or is it for somebody else? And I think when I think about like Jim Collins and why was he so impactful? Because he was super curious about solving an issue about why did one company grow in the Fortune 500 and why did one fail? Like what were the differences? And he didn't do all of that work and all that research to publish a book that was about him. It was to publish a book to help solve
Sure.
a problem. And I think that's the advice I'd give any author today.
Fantastic. Well, this has been great, Jamie. I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you sharing your story, and I appreciate learning from what you've done along the way. I think there's lots of nuggets here for people to be able to digest and take
Awesome.
away.
Thanks so much for your time, Peter.
Thanks. To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.